Okay, so I thought today I'd read a mixture of old and new poems. When I was a student, I spent quite a lot of time in Paris where I was studying for a degree. And to begin with, I knew absolutely no one. I was pretty lonely. And I found myself starting to write prose poems under the influence of Arthur Rimbaud and the Portuguese poet Eugênio de Andrade. And because I was away from home, paradoxically, I became quite interested in the Scots language. And so this first poem brings some of these interests together. Dustie-Fute. When I opened my window and reached for the yogurt cooling on the outside ledge, it had gone. All that remained was a single Scottish word, bewildered by the Paris winter frost and the lights of its riverbank motorways. What can Dustie-Fute have to say to a night like this? How can it dangle on its hyphen down into the Rue Geoffroy Lanier, where Danton stayed on the eve of revolution? How can it tame this strangeness for me, or change me into the cupolas and flagstones I so desire, yet still notice every time I walk among them? Does the auld alliance of words and things stand a chance among the traffic and pimps in the Publicis Saint-Germain? For it's not as if Dustie-Fute were my familiar. I could easily confuse Dustie-Fute with elf-mill, which is the sound made by a worm in the timber of a house, supposed by the vulgar to be preternatural. These words are as foreign as the city they have parachuted into, dead words slipping on the sill of a living metropolis. They are extremes that touch like dangerous wires, and the only hope for them, for us, is the space they inhabit, a room veering between dilettantism and dynamite. Old Scots word, big French city, and in between, abysmal me. In merchant or creamer, qua hes no certain dwelling place, where the dust may be dicht fra his feet or shown. Dustie-Fute, a stranger, equivalent to ferend man, at a loss in the empty soul of his ancestors' beautiful language and in the soulless city of his compeers, living the 21st century now and scoffing at his medieval wares. Yet here, precisely here, is their rendezvous, and triumphantly, stuffed down his sock, an oblique sense, the Dustie-Fute of revelry, the acrobat, the juggler who accompanies the toe-belled jongleur with his merchant's comic fairground face. He reaches deep into his base Latinity, into his pede pulverosi, and French descendants pull out their own pied poudreux. Dustie-Fute remembers previous lives amid the plate glass of Léal. They magnify his motley, his meaty oranges, his hawker lyrics, and for a second, Beaubourg words graze Scottish glass, then glance apart. In this revelry, differences copulate, become more visible and bearable, and stranger than the words or city I inhabit, I reach for my yogurt and find it there. Well, the sense of difference that's outlined in that poem eventually manifested itself in the realization that I was gay. And so this next poem comes from my second collection, Un Tour d'Écosse, and it finds its metaphors in Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream, which I'd recently seen at the theatre. It also contains traces of a visit to an exhibition of David Hockney paintings in London. And I couldn't help comparing the colourful Californian lifestyle that I saw depicted in those paintings, particularly a painting that showed Christopher Isherwood and Don Bacardi's apartment. I couldn't help comparing all that to my own experience in Glasgow. So this next poem is called Wall. It has a little epigraph from A Midsummer Night's Dream, from the play that Bottom and the so-called rude mechanicals put on. Pyramus, oh kiss me through the hole of this vile wall. Thisbe, I kiss the wall, not your lips at all. Look at the wall, the sweet and lovely wall we carry with us in public places. Even in meadows, when we rest it for a second on muscular buttercups, its tininess glimpsed from the distances of outer galaxies is not as small as the monstrous little voice I use to whisper to you through its chink. And in the streets of Glasgow, where we set it down, despite the looks, to share affection over lattes and Versace suits, we can hear the awkward avalanche of lime and mortar evolve within its frame, as we kneel down and seek out chink and speak our cherry words knit up in hair and stone. Even here, on Pear Blossom Highway or Garrowby Hill, where you can barely see it for the Hockney colours and sentimentalists mistake it for a rainbow, it is a wall that bears our mottos of restraint. And in the Japanese storyboard of Chris and Dawn's Malibu interior, where even the wicker chairs are clearly gay, at ease with their own maturity, wall balances between the pockets of our cargo pants as we meander through, fearful of pratfall, putty on the pinewood floor. Some say chink offers us the virtue of cubist perspective, the silk forest of your earlobes' blonde, still baby hairs. Polaroided and collaged in a cakewalk of mismatching edges, our groins grow a wall. Exciting textures are described, but no one ever asks us what it weighs. Others tell us to ignore it, drape our bodies in a magnetic web of invisible embraces, a shimmering virtual cloth of Proustian complexity beyond the deconstructive powers of Peter Quince. We touch our asses' heads like caps, pick up our wall and walk. True, chink's lynx eye offers us a precious parsimony of moments, the time the slits of our lapels smiled to fill the whole of that slim orifice, the time your pinky stroked a whisker of my orange tawny beard, my purple and grain beard, my French crown colour beard. And no one noticed. But those who see our wall and label it know about its chink as well, the slight pucker of its lips, which taste of cold, chipped tile. Name it only for the fuckhole of Bully Bottom's rude mechanicals. Everywhere we turn, we find out moonshine. Smash wall, smash the person of wall and the person of pure moonshine. So an art exhibition also lies behind this next poem. Back in 2011, I was in Washington, D.C., and I went to an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery called Hide and Seek, which consisted of portraits by and of largely American artists who identified themselves or were identified as lesbian and gay. And as I wandered around the exhibition, I kept on seeing aspects of the Orpheus myth in each of the portraits. So this next poem is called The Bachelor Stripped Bare by His Brides Even, which is an ironic play on a title of a work by the artist Marcel Duchamp. And there was, in the exhibition, there was a very striking portrait of Marcel Duchamp's head by Florine Stettheimer. This wonderful, completely bald head of Marcel Duchamp stares out at the spectator. So this is a poem about Duchamp, but it's also, in a way, a portrait of Orpheus as seen by Eurydice. The bachelor stripped bare by his brides even. If I place my eye to the peephole in this rock, I can just make out his head staring back at me from the borders of the morning. Light suspends it, blinds me as I again unpack the shadows. Who would have gone with him? In order to descend that never-ending staircase and pass through the smallest crevice, he planed his limbs so they could be closer to me at every moment. He shed beauty like a snake, skinned his retina so no pleasure could take root. Infra-thin rouge on lips was all that told me he was there. That and his suitcase, an album with his latest songs perhaps, or space for me. It was touching, if I could still be touched. But I was an idea now, and when he turned to me, wrapped in his coat, it was just to share the thought that 2 blue threads floating from his sleeve could help him measure chance. What was he thinking? I turned away back into the diagram of caverns. Still, I see that head in my mind's eye, like a bicycle wheel attached to a stool, spinning out the same song, same thread, same net. I raise up my arms and slip nothing on. So the next poem I'm going to read was written after a bit of a misunderstanding on a social media platform, and it's also from this same collection, my most recent one, In Search of Dustie-Fute, and it's just called Text. And there is a reference to a gay hookup app called Scruff in it. Text. Mohammed texted me on Scruff from Alexandria. I mentioned Cavafy, and he asked me when I'll visit. I think of Egypt, Shakespeare. Never, I reply, it's too far. Then I clock he means the one in Western Bartonshire, and blush. Cavafy was Greek, he says. I'm Syrian and a refugee. Constantine Cavafy would have known just what to say then from his careful room. He dealt in exiles mainly, some refugees, and had a knack for letting the window veil blow back at the turn of a line so we can see young Antony glint briefly from his high abandoned tower block, sense his fate blow out along the second best streets of a second-hand city. Mohammed is waiting for me to reply as I write this poem. It is 19.25 miles from Glasgow to Alexandria. Some years ago, I wrote a whole sequence of poems which attempt to give some of the women in the Bible a voice. Normally, they're pretty silent. St. Paul was famous for writing to lots of Christian communities, and so I decided it might be interesting to listen to one of those communities writing back to St. Paul. So this is the first letter of the Hebrew women to St. Paul. Hebrew women, apostles of Christ Jesus to Paul, alleged saint, notorious scribbler, grace to you and peace from God our Father. Now look here. Adam could have said, no thanks, or apples disagree with me. He didn't. He had a bite as well. So he was deceived, just like Eve. We're equal and get used to it. We washed his feet, made his tea, stood under the cross. Where were you? On some road to Damascus. Useless. Chapter 2. This new covenant is all very well, but we have a soft spot for the old one. That tabernacle had our best candlesticks in it, a gold jar with jam by manna and a lot of tablet. We want it back. You promise this and you promise that. Be quiet. Let the hidden person of the heart speak out. Chapter the last. Every Tom, Dick and Harry's given hospitality at yours in case they might be angels. Fine, but haven't you noticed the spinning saucers we've got above our heads? Faith is a stubborn doubt before what you despair of, and the conviction of things you can see with your own 2 eyes. This next poem is just a simple love poem, and it was written after a trip to Canada. Bed. The moment the light goes out, he sleeps, a gift from the dark. There is the small chime of the moon on the wall, the deep freeze digesting in the kitchen. He floats from head to toe on the buzz of his snore, dreaming the calm glide of a jasper ski lift, the summer elk that trotted out of forest beneath our dangling feet. His arm crooks the violin of my head. I elbow him away, intent on sleep, but suddenly, unpegged by a gust of dreams, we roll together in the hot hole of his mum's old bed, dribbling on the pillows. Waking, he has me in an arm lock, our legs a single rope of flesh, my earlobe tickled by his breath. I reach behind me and shove my hand between his thighs. He stretches, opening briefly like a centerfold, a light smile of welcome on his lips. But more than this is the scrape of the 2 o'clock beetle, the nip of a dust mite, my scratch, my love disturbed by me, awake but patient in the dark. All the other poems that I'm going to read today were written during lockdown, the first period of lockdown in Glasgow. And some of them directly relate to that predicament. Others seem to echo it in more oblique ways. The first one I'm going to read is about a painting by Sandro Botticelli called Mystic Nativity, or it's based on that poem. And aside from the usual subject matter, it shows a variety of angelic couples and even a few devils embracing each other in the foreground. This moved me particularly because that experience of touch, of a simple handshake, seems to be something that we've lost for the time being. So this first poem is called Mystic Nativity. If an angel stopped in the lane before our barn or the turreted castle and turned to embrace me, oh the hugs, oh the stopping and stopping. I would brush aside wings and shake his hand. I would dance all the friendly angels out of their domes, their stables, why even the 7 small devils shake crestfallen hands before heading to hell. May I turn to you then, as the child in the manger turns from his swaddling shroud. Unfold the wings of your palms like a gamp. You remember the loosening rain, the dull earthly weather, how we shared the braille of our lifelines, those touching gifts. Was this in our lifetime? Now, loose the arm from the shoulder, the right one, the left one. Remember the hand. Cross the painting's meridian just into the lane by the barn. Initially, just after lockdown started, I was scared to go outside. I kept my walks to an absolute minimum. I live in a block of flats in Glasgow, and I would simply walk around the block or up and down the little tree-lined terrace in front of my flat. And from time to time, I would notice my neighbours doing all sorts of odd jobs that they'd probably been putting off for decades. And now suddenly they had too much time on their hands and they were getting round to them. This poem is called Sugar. These words should be unearthed. They make do with all that oiling and caulking, finicky odd jobs at last getting done, or the plonk plink from an open window where time passes its life. They dream of ambergris, castoreum, civet, musk, sweet, earthy, marine, animalic, pomanders against the plague. This aftermath is like la petite mort, but only like. Words knock on the bark of trees, barking to be let back in to the sugar, the gravity, the heartwood. This next poem is an elegy for a friend of mine, a painter, who died many years ago in an accidental drowning. And we spent a few months together on a residence. She was an artist in residence, and I was a writer in residence at Grès-sur-Loing in France. And when we became friends, and when she left, she gave me a little painting, a small painting, a square painting, with just some simple colours on it, some simple abstract colours. And I'd never really thought about the painting until, again, I had all this time in my hands, and so I started to wonder about it a bit. And this poem is called Savour. Today my screensaver has changed its mind and gives me reds, yellows, hills and a loch with autumn swimming in it. Simple pleasure. That strange painting you gave me, a square of pure colour with the French words ocre sur jaune sur orange picked out before we parted. And now, 16 years later, I ask its meaning for the first time. Does ochre plus yellow give us orange? The first caves were full of ochre, prehistory painted with nothing else. In Wales, there is the 33,000-year-old Red Lady of Paviland, and egg yolks, canaries, corn and buttercups, gold, humour, gentleness and cowardice are yellow. The list seems endless. Ah, here is yellow ochre also, and we are back again at Altamira with its lovely yellow ochre horse. It carried us away from each other, led me to this short poem for you, too short and so long after 16 years, and you to a sudden death by drowning. Why ask its meaning? You shared earth's simple pigments with me. We learn our meanings from the words we have already used. Just before lockdown started, I made a trip to London, and while I was waiting on the platform to get onto the tube at Walthamstow, I noticed this very striking middle-aged woman in a long coat standing there, and she looked strangely as if she was partly human and partly like some kind of art object that had stepped out of an art gallery or a museum. So this is Carved Woman with Stone Bird. The carved woman with stone bird at her breast waits for the tube at Walthamstow. She lost her first meanings 1,000 years ago, and the commuter's projections bounce off her with a fierce rattle of the train or other stones skiffed across water. Perhaps she has forgotten how the man took the bird and it flew off like glory, how he placed a child there instead, or how the bird came down again and she was venerated once more. Perhaps she has forgotten how the sea once carved her and the bird to look like a woman with a bird at her breast. Perhaps she has forgotten how she lost her colour or stepped from a frieze, carved and cold and grey. How she almost put childish things away, seduced by our complicit smiles, then drew back into her real stone world, where a pebble is a mountain, a tree, or a person. She sits opposite us now, the opposite of a sign. She is not mathematical or pictorial, and she is not a story. When she alights, she is the pavement beneath our boots, a stone in your shoe. She recognizes others as she leaves, who have no roof but the sky, and how they too are stones, although they are made of flesh. And the last poem I'm going to read it kind of brings me full circle because it takes its title from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's just called Welcome Wanderer. And again, it's about the experience of living in a block of flats in Glasgow, and although we have a shared back garden, a shared green, during lockdown, that time was very much at a premium. Welcome Wanderer. I know a bench that the sun strikes at precisely 10 a.m. At 10:02, I take my coffee to the garden and sit for 15 minutes. These are my minutes, no one else's. A neighbour may come down, stand gravely hanging washing, and comment from his distance, acknowledging my freehold of this time. But that is all that he can do. By 10:18, I'm back inside, and the garden fills to the sounds of a little girl chattering to her dad, new neighbours. They will reign there for much longer, but I will not grudge this. The young are made for light. Next, we measure flour for cakes and feed 3 spoons of honey to granola. Later, I walk the flowering terrace for 40 minutes and wish a beast of trig and math, a hovering bird with violet eyes more accurate than mine. It drinks me from these sums. Honeysuckle floods the air with wings. Indoors again, a bumblebee bumps up against the pane, and we go straight to bed at 10 to get our 8 hours straight. We dream the same dreams every night, dreams the same as days like these, although there are no numbers, just the immeasurable space, avenues empty of cars and buses, people, hummingbirds.